Come with me tonight into the world of Victorian servants, the rules they lived by and the selves they kept private. The cold is the first thing, not the cold you feel from an open window, the kind you choose, the cold that lives in stone corridors at 4 a.m, the kind that settles into brick and doesn't leave until noon. It's already there before you arrive, and you've been arriving since before dawn. You're standing at a door on the side of the house. Not the front door. That one isn't for you, never that one. You've come around the back through the gate in the garden wall, down the steps that descend below street level. This entrance exists specifically so that no one upstairs has to witness the moment you arrive. The family's house begins at the front steps, with the black painted door and the brass knocker polished to a mirror. Your house begins here, in this narrow passage, with a door that has no knocker at all. This morning is your first day. You were hired 3 days ago, shown to the housekeeper's parlour, and given a list of duties and a time to arrive. You were told the hours and the rules and the expectations, and then you were told something you hadn't quite anticipated. Your name, the housekeeper said, is Mary. Your name is not Mary. It has never been Mary. You've had the same name your entire life, the one your mother gave you, the one you answered to in every house and lane and field you've passed through. But the household already has a Mary. There's always been a Mary in this house. The girl before you was Mary. The girl before her was Mary too. It's simply easier, the housekeeper explained, if the arrangement continues. You will be Mary. That is where we begin. Not with the rules about the stairs, or the rules about speaking, or the rules about who you were and weren't permitted to love. We begin with a name, because losing your name on the first day is the cleanest possible introduction to what life in Victorian domestic service was actually like. By the time we're through, you'll understand not just what servants were forbidden from doing. You'll understand what all those small, daily, compulsory erasures quietly added up to, and why someone who'd spent 40 years in service could arrive at the end of it, feeling she'd lived in some essential way as someone else. The fire in the kitchen grate is already lit. Someone got here before you and made sure of that. Let's step inside. Picture a grand house in the middle of England. The year is 1873. Not a palace, but not a modest home either. The kind of house that has a name, a gravel drive, a garden with a formal wall, and enough rooms that you could live in it for a month and not be certain you'd found all of them. The family who owns it employs 14 servants. This is considered a well-staffed, respectable household. Not extravagant. Respectable. You're not at the front of that house. You never are. You came in through the servants' entrance, cut into the side wall of the building, separated from the main facade by an angle of masonry. Architects in this era designed houses with this specifically in mind. The placement of the service wing, the routing of the back stairs, the narrowing of certain corridors, all of it was calculated, not as an afterthought, as an intention. The family should be able to move through their house and encounter no evidence of the effort required to maintain it. That was the design brief, in a very real sense. You carry coals this morning. You carry them from the coal cellar in the basement up the back stairs, which are narrow and steep and lit only by a single window at the landing. You'll make this trip 5 or 6 times before breakfast. The back stairs are not carpeted. Your footsteps are muffled because you've learned, over time, to place your weight carefully, heel first, then toe, so the tread doesn't announce you. An arriving servant is a disturbance. You've been trained not to be one. The front staircase is a different world entirely. You've seen it. You clean it, in the early hours when the family is still asleep. It's wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side. It has a carved banister, a runner of burgundy carpet pinned at every tread, a chandelier above the landing that catches the first light from the tall window at the turn. It is a beautiful thing, and it is not for you, not under any ordinary circumstances, not if there's another way to reach where you're going. If you were to use the front stairs, to be seen on them by the family, to appear in the main hall at an inconvenient moment, it would be a transgression. The word used at the time was improper. It would reflect badly on the housekeeper who trained you, on the household standards, and on your own sense of your position. And your sense of your position in a Victorian household was expected to be keen. Your position is below. That's not a metaphor. It's geography. Your rooms are below the main floor. Your entrance is below street level. Your world is below their world in almost every physical sense. When they ring a bell, you go up. When you've finished, you come back down. The house is built in 2 layers, and you inhabit the lower one. The kitchen is here, and the scullery beside it, and the servants' hall where you take your meals, and the housekeeper's parlour, and the butler's pantry where the silver is kept in a locked cabinet. There's a laundry room, a lamp room where the oil lamps are cleaned and filled each morning, a boot room for outdoor shoes, a still room where the housekeeper makes preserves and keeps her accounts. The basement is its own small city, warm in the kitchen at least, smelling of bread and tallow and the faint iron tang of the range. You'll spend the majority of your waking hours here. A good portion of the work happens before anyone upstairs would think of it. It's barely 5 in the morning when you start. The fires must be laid in the family's rooms before they wake. Not just laid, but burning, so that when the mistress opens her bedroom door, the room is already warm. You come in silently in your working dress, carrying everything you need. You're not to wake her. You're not to be seen. You open the grate, remove the ash, clean the tiles with a cloth, lay the paper and the kindling, then the coal, then the match. You do it quietly enough that someone sleeping 3 feet away remains asleep, and then you leave without a word. If she wakes while you're there, you don't speak unless she speaks first. If she asks you something, you answer briefly and plainly. Then you go. The invisibility isn't simply a preference. It's a professional standard. The household runs best, in the Victorian understanding of that word, when there's no perceivable gap between a room in a pristine state and a room arriving at a pristine state. No evidence of the transition. No reminder of the 2 trips up the back stairs with a hod of coal and a box of matches. By the time the family sits down to breakfast, you've been at work for 4 hours. There's a particular rule that governs what happens if you encounter the family in a corridor, or on the stairs, or anywhere in the main part of the house at an unplanned moment. You're to give room. That was the phrase used, give room. Step aside to the wall, quickly and without drawing attention to the movement itself. Wait until they've passed. Don't make eye contact unless invited. Don't speak. Don't smile in a way that presumes familiarity. In some of the grandest houses this went further still. Housemaids in certain households were trained to step into a side room entirely if the family appeared in a corridor, not to move aside but to vanish, to remove themselves from the visual field so completely that the encounter never technically happened. There's something almost difficult to hold in your mind from this distance about what that daily reality required. A person doing the work of keeping a house alive, carrying the coal, laying the fire, making the bed, bringing the water, systematically removing herself from the evidence of that work, cleaning up after the cleaning, not just invisible labour, but a person made invisible by it. And yet, inside the logic of the time, it made a kind of sense. The reasoning was this. A gentleman's home was his sanctuary. His world above stairs should be ordered, calm and undisturbed. If he could see the mechanism of his household at work, it implied the mechanism was imperfect. A perfectly run house was one where things simply appeared to be as they should, without your visible effort, without encounter, without reminder that any of this cost anything at all. The servant who had mastered this wasn't praised for it. They weren't praised at all. That was the point. The coal was there, the fire was warm, the breakfast appeared. Nobody needed to know anything else, and behind that coal and that fire and that breakfast was a person who had been awake since before 4 a.m, who had her own name and her own history, and who was going to answer to someone else's name for the rest of the day, because in this house it was simply easier. Consider the physical geography of your day. There are rooms in this house you'll enter regularly, and rooms you'll enter only to clean, and rooms you'll never enter at all. The library is yours in the sense that you must dust it, but only before the family is up, and only from the threshold unless specifically instructed otherwise. The drawing room is yours to clean but not to linger in. The master's study is not yours at any hour. If something needs doing in the study, the butler handles it, or the valet. Your presence there would be an irregularity. The house is a kind of map, and not every part of it has your name on it. Actually, nothing has your name on it, including your name. The boundaries are not written down for the most part. That's one of the stranger qualities of the Victorian servants' world. The most important rules were the ones that existed nowhere in writing. They were transmitted through the housekeeper when you arrived, through watching the woman who had the job before you, through the quiet correction of a senior servant who caught you doing something wrong before anyone more important could notice. You learned them the way you learn most things in this world, by being corrected until you didn't need to be anymore. The front door is a useful example. If a tradesman arrives with the delivery, they come to the side entrance, your entrance. If a visitor arrives to call on the family, they come to the front. If you need to carry something out of the house and around to a different part of the property, you take the servant's path through the kitchen garden, not the gravel drive. None of this is explained to you as a policy. It is simply the way the house works, and you are part of the way the house works, and so it is the way you work too. The first morning is always the longest. Not because there is more to do. The days are all roughly as full as each other, beginning before 5 and rarely ending before 10 at night. But because it is the first day you do all of it as Mary, and somewhere below the surface of that word in a place you don't yet have language for, you already know that something is different now. The people who built this system didn't think of it as cruelty. That's worth understanding. They thought of it as order, the proper arrangement of things in a world that needed arranging. A house with 12 people in it, and no hierarchy would be chaos. Roles had to be defined, boundaries had to be maintained, deference had to run in one direction. What they perhaps didn't fully account for was what it cost to maintain that order, not in money, not in labour, but in the quiet daily compression of a life lived inside someone else's rules, someone else's schedule, and someone else's name. That cost was real, and it was paid in full every single day. To understand how it worked, who enforced it, who obeyed it, and how the whole architecture of it held together, you need to go further into the house, down the back stairs, past the lamp room and the boot room and the still room, into the servants' hall where the hierarchy of below stairs was observed just as carefully, just as rigidly, and just as entirely without question as the one upstairs that everyone had already agreed to accept. The servants' hall in a house like this one is a long rectangular room with bare walls and a central table that runs most of its length. The benches on either side are not cushioned. The light comes from lamps, and the smell is of wood smoke and boiled vegetables and the particular closeness of people who've been working since before sunrise. You eat here 3 times a day, breakfast, dinner, supper, and the meal is served at times set by the housekeeper and not adjusted for the pace of your morning. At the head of the table sits the butler. At his right, the housekeeper. Everyone else finds their place according to their rank, and their rank is not ambiguous and not subject to renegotiation. This is the hierarchy of below stairs, and it is observed with the same unsentimental precision as the hierarchy upstairs. In some ways, more so. The butler is the highest-ranking male servant in the house. You'll notice quickly that he's not called by his first name. He's called by his surname, Mr. Rivers, the upper housemaid says. And that is the first signal you receive that he occupies a different category of person in this world than you do. His domain is specific and protected. He holds the key to the wine cellar, which is kept locked and accessed only by him. He manages the plate, the silver cutlery, the serving dishes, the candlesticks, stored in a locked cabinet in his pantry and cleaned on a schedule he determines. He oversees the male staff. He reports to the master of the house, and in practice that report happens once a day, briefly, and then the butler runs everything else himself. He is calm. He moves without hurry. He's been doing this for 25 years, and the particular unhurried calm of someone who has mastered their domain completely is one of the more imposing things you will encounter in this house. He rarely raises his voice. He doesn't need to. The housekeeper operates an equivalent sphere. She is Mrs. Whitmore. She is not, as far as anyone is certain, actually a widow, but the title Mrs. is given to housekeepers as a professional courtesy, regardless of marital status. It was one of the small fictions that Victorian domestic service ran on quite deliberately. A housekeeper addressed as Mrs. carried an authority that a bare first name could not have conveyed. She's addressed formally. Her instructions are followed without argument. She manages the female staff. She counts the linen, keeps the accounts for the domestic stores, interviews new maids, and decides who stays and who goes. And she carries, at her waist, a ring of keys. You'll hear those keys before you see her, most mornings. A small metallic sound coming down the corridor, and by the time you do hear them, you've already straightened your posture and composed your expression into something neutral. The sound of Mrs. Whitmore's keys is, in a very practical sense, the sound of authority moving through the house. Below the butler and the housekeeper, and there is a genuine chasm of status between them and everyone else, are the lady's maid and the valet. These two occupy a curious position in the household's architecture. They don't manage staff, they don't hold keys, but they're not lower servants either. They work most closely with the family. The lady's maid dresses the mistress, cares for her clothes and jewellery, accompanies her on travel, and sometimes becomes a kind of confidant that no footman or kitchen maid could be. The valet does the same for the master. Your master, as the household would have put it. They know things, in other words. And that proximity, to the family's moods, to their private conversations, to the texture of their actual daily lives, gave them a currency below stairs that their job title didn't quite capture. They ate separately from the lower servants, in the housekeeper's room with the upper staff every evening. This was not a small distinction. The physical separation of meal times was a daily enacted performance of rank. Everyone at the long table knew exactly what it meant when the upper servants rose before pudding and left the room without a word. The footman comes next, and the footman is, if you look at him honestly, partly a functional servant and partly a piece of furniture. This is not unkind. It was the practical reality of the role, openly acknowledged at the time. In the grandest households, footmen were selected partly on the basis of height. A matched pair of footmen, similar height, similar build, similar proportions in livery, was considered a mark of a well-appointed house. The livery itself was elaborate. Powdered hair in formal service, knee breeches, white stockings, a coat in the family's colours. You wouldn't engage a footman under 5'10" if you could avoid it, and in the very grandest houses a difference of an inch between two footmen was grounds for a quiet rearrangement of staff. That was a real and ordinary practice. Worth letting sit for a moment. A man could be assessed for his position the way a horse was assessed for purchase, by his physical proportions, and whether those proportions matched the man who would be standing next to him at dinner. And yet the footman himself understood exactly what was happening. Your footman, if you had been the employer. Yourself, if you had been the footman. He dressed in the livery that was handed to him. He stood at the correct height next to the man who was measured to stand beside him. He answered the door and served the silver and composed his face into the required neutrality. He knew the calculation that had been made about his body and his proportions, and he performed the result of that calculation with complete professionalism. That professionalism, the gap between what you privately understood and what you were professionally required to perform, is the thread that runs through the footman's experience and every other experience we followed tonight. The servant who knew exactly what she was worth and was required to perform something smaller. The woman who knew her own name and was required to answer to another. The man who knew his own family and was required to act as though they didn't exist on Monday through Saturday and most of Sunday. The gap was real, and so was the performance, both of them simultaneously in the same body every day. The footman's work was visible, your face, your height, your livery, all of it on display. He served at table, he answered the front door, he carried messages, attended the family's outings, stood at formal functions with his hands behind his back and his face composed into careful neutrality. He was the household's public face, the person a visitor actually saw, and so his appearance was managed, his dress was specified, and his deportment was understood to reflect directly on the family's standing. He was always on display, and yet the rules of silence and deference applied to him exactly as they applied to everyone else. You could be the most visible servant in the house, and still not permitted to speak unless someone spoke to you first. Below the footman, the pyramid widens. The housemaid, your rank or close to it, cleans the family's rooms. She works in the earliest hours before anyone upstairs is awake, and again in the evenings after they've retired. The middle of the day, when the rooms are in use, is not her time. She exists in the gaps of the family's day, filling the space between their waking and sleeping with work they're never supposed to witness. The kitchen maid assists the cook, and begins her morning scarcely later than you begin yours. The kitchen runs on an unforgiving schedule, the cook at its centre, everything else rotating around her. And the kitchen maid's job is to make sure that rotation doesn't stall. And below the kitchen maid, at the absolute base of the household's visible world, is the scullery maid. The scullery maid washes. That is, in its essence, her function. She washes the pots and pans and dishes and utensils that the kitchen generates from before dawn until after dark. Her hands, your hands, if that had been your morning, are raw. The water varies between cold and scalding depending on what stage of the work she's in. She eats where she finds a moment to eat. She's often 13 or 14. This is frequently her first job. She's not given a great deal of thought by the people above her. That too is part of the system. Now, here is the rule that makes the whole structure cohere, the one that mirrors below stairs, the rule that governs how you speak to the family above. Lower servants are not to speak to upper servants unless spoken to first, not the butler, not the housekeeper, not the lady's maid. You may answer when addressed. You may deliver a message if you've been sent to deliver one. But you do not start a conversation. You do not offer your opinion. You do not step forward into a space that hasn't been opened for you. This rule meant that the hierarchy replicated itself at every level. The servant deferred to the upper servant, who deferred to the family. The whole structure was a set of nested silences, each one containing the last, all the way from the scullery maid at the bottom to the family at the top. What's striking, if you step back from it, is how completely the world below stairs reproduced the values of the world above it. The hierarchy was rigid. The deference ran downward. Rank was observed in where you sat, in what you were called, in whether you were permitted to speak first. The family believed in order, propriety, and the maintenance of social distance. And so, below stairs, did the butler. The system taught itself. New servants learned from the servants who'd been there longer. The rules of deference were absorbed before anyone stopped to question them. And questioning them, practically daily, out loud, wasn't really available as an option. You ate at the long table, you sat where your rank put you. When the upper servants rose before pudding and retired to the housekeeper's room, you remained with the other lower servants and finished your meal in their company, without comment. It wasn't personal, it was structural. And structural things have a way of feeling like weather, as though they've always existed and always will, and there's not much use in having a view about them. But it wasn't the weather. It was built piece by careful piece, by people who benefited from it. And behind every piece of it was a decision, made long enough ago that it no longer looked like one. Now that you understand the shape of the world you've walked into, the entrances, the staircases, the seating order, the keys, there's something the housekeeper said to you this morning that we still haven't quite finished with. She told you your name. She told you what it was going to be from now on, and what she was really doing, though she'd never have put it this way, was telling you that the household had needs, and you were going to be arranged around those needs, and your name was simply the first arrangement. It would not be the last. Let's begin with the mechanics of it, because the mechanics are strange enough on their own. When a household decided that all its housemaids would be called Mary, this wasn't done maliciously in the main. It was done for convenience. And the convenience reveals something about how the employer understood the nature of the person they were hiring. Consider what the renaming assumes. It assumes that the name a person arrives with is a negotiable feature of that person, one that can be set aside, replaced, or overridden to suit the needs of the household. It assumes that the woman herself is, in some essential way, secondary to the role she will be filling. The role has a name. The role has always had that name. You are the latest person to fill it. And so the name comes with the position, and the position doesn't ask what name you arrived with. In households with multiple footmen, 2, 3, 4 men in livery, the problem of names was sometimes solved numerically. If all the footmen were called John, you distinguish between them as John 1, John 2, John 3. This is documented. It happened in the households of the aristocracy, in the houses of the very wealthy, in the places where propriety was most stringently observed. The men serving the finest silver on the finest linen, in rooms hung with paintings worth more than they would earn in a lifetime, were distinguished from each other by a number appended to someone else's name. The practicality of it was not lost on anyone. The indignity of it was also not something that anyone was expected to mention. What did it feel like? What would it feel like to you, to answer every day to a name that wasn't yours? The historical record is largely quiet on this point, because the historical record is largely written by people who weren't servants. The voices from below stairs are rare and fragile things, surviving mostly by accident or by the particular persistence of individuals who refuse to let their inner lives go unrecorded. Hannah Cullwick was one of those individuals. She was born in Shifnal in Shropshire in 1833, the daughter of a master saddler, and she went into service young, as most girls in her circumstances did. She spent the better part of 40 years as a domestic servant. 40 years, if you stop to let that settle, is most of a working life, working across a variety of households in England, in roles that range from nursemaid to maid-of-all-work. She was not famous. She did not do anything that anyone at the time would have considered historically significant. She scrubbed floors and cleaned boots and lit fires and carried coals and emptied slops and made beds and washed dishes and started again the following morning. And she wrote it all down. From 1854 to 1873, Hannah Cullwick kept a diary. Not an occasional journal, not a record of major events. A daily diary. And if that had been your diary, it would have looked much the same, in which she documented with extraordinary particularity the specific texture of her working life, what she cleaned, how long it took, how heavy the coal hod was, how many stairs between the cellar and the bedroom, how her hands looked at the end of a day of scrubbing. She wrote in pencil, in a small notebook, after everyone else in the house was asleep. What she produced, without intending to produce anything beyond a private record, was one of the most detailed accounts of Victorian working life that has ever survived. Historians have returned to it again and again because it tells you things that no household manual and no newspaper and no employer's memoir can tell you. It tells you what the work felt like from inside the body that was doing it. Here is what a typical morning looked like, drawn from her diary entries. She rose before 5. She opened the shutters in the kitchen and lit the kitchen fire. She cleaned the range, your range, in her version of the world, the ash, the grate, the tiles around it. She swept and dusted the downstairs rooms. She laid the hearth in the parlour. She brought up the breakfast things. She cleaned 2 pairs of boots. She made the beds. She emptied the slops from the bedroom washstands, which is what it sounds like, and required carrying those containers down the back stairs without spilling and disposing of them in the appropriate place in the yard. She cleaned the breakfast dishes. She cleaned the plate, she cleaned the knives, she got dinner ready, and then she began preparing your meal. Not yours specifically, but the family's, the one she wouldn't eat. This is not a summary of a week, this is one morning. She recorded not just the tasks, but the conditions in which she performed them. On a cold morning in February, she noted that the water in the basin in her room had frozen overnight, and she broke the ice with her hands before washing. That detail, so specific, so physical, is the kind of thing no official household record would ever have captured. She noticed the texture of her own labour in a way that the employers who supervised it often couldn't. She recorded the weight of things, the distance between things, the number of times she carried a particular load between a particular 2 points, details so specific that reading them now, you almost feel the weight yourself. She noted when a task was harder than expected and when it was easier. She noted when her body was tired in specific ways. Her back, her knees, her hands, which she described at various points as very rough and quite hard and red. Cullwick noticed this. She noted it without complaint, with the same matter-of-fact attention she gave to the number of steps between the kitchen and the coal cellar. But she noticed it. She was, in her notebooks, a precise and reliable observer of the world she inhabited and the body doing the inhabiting. What she couldn't always see from inside it was what the whole of it added up to from the outside. That's simply the limit of being inside any experience. You see the morning, you see the task, you see the particular cold on a February morning when the water in the basin has frozen. You don't necessarily see the pattern across 50 years of similar mornings in similar basins in similar cold rooms across England. We can see the pattern now because the Diaries survived. The pattern is this: a life of extraordinary physical labour, performed in conditions of extraordinary social constraint, by a person of extraordinary interior life, which is, in the end, exactly the description of most of the lives below stairs in Victorian England. Not all extraordinary in the same way, not all possessed of someone who wrote it down, but all of them real in their specific and ordinary particularity. Real in the mornings, your mornings, her mornings. Real in the evenings. Real in the specific weight of the coal hod and the roughness of the hands and the name signed in pencil at the end of a long day. That realness was always there, underneath the rules and the silence and the borrowed names, the people, and all of it, every step, every trip, every quiet, careful movement on the uncarpeted stairs, was performed in the condition of invisibility the household required. The family didn't think about who had done any of this, because the mark of a well-run house was precisely that you didn't need to. Things were clean, fires were warm, meals appeared. The machinery hummed without anyone upstairs having to hear it. The machinery had a name, her actual name, the one she signed in her diary. But the household used a different one. She kept writing because she had something to say, even when there was no one to say it to. That's the part that stays with you. Not the labour, extraordinary as it was, but the fact of the record itself. Someone who was, by every structural measure, supposed to be invisible, supposed to be interchangeable, supposed to answer to whatever name was most convenient. That person wrote it all down, every single day, with the same quiet persistence she brought to the boots and the grate and the slops. She documented her own erasure, and in doing so she prevented it. There's something almost defiant in that, though defiance isn't the word she would have used. The renaming happened to her too, in various forms across her years in service. She was sometimes addressed by a shortened version of her name, sometimes by a pet name her employers invented. Your name replaced by their preference, without negotiation. Sometimes simply as the girl, or by her role, the maid, the cook, the woman downstairs. The formal record of her existence was her name. The daily reality of her existence was whatever the household found most convenient. This was true at almost every level of service, with one notable exception. Upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, were addressed by their surnames, with the honorific, Mr. Rivers, Mrs. Whitmore. This mattered more than it might appear to. The surname implied a history, a family, a lineage, the quiet suggestion of a person who existed before this house, and would exist after it. The first name alone, especially a generic one, implied the reverse. You arrived. You filled the role. You could be replaced by someone who answered to the same name, and the household would barely notice. The gap between Mr. Rivers and Mary was not merely social convention. It was a daily statement about whose identity the household considered real enough to use. At the very top of the female hierarchy, there was occasionally a version of the renaming that went further still. In some households, a lady's maid who had served for years would be given a new name when a new mistress arrived, if the new mistress preferred it that way. Her previous name, associated in the new mistress's mind with someone else, a previous time, was simply retired. She became whatever the mistress found pleasant. There was no form you filled out. There was no objection you could register. There was simply a morning when someone with more authority than you decided what you would be called, and that was what you were called from then on. Your name was the first thing given to you at birth. In Victorian service, it was also, routinely, the first thing taken. And the thing that gets quietly lost in all the history of rules and restrictions, in the hierarchies and the conduct books and the back stairs and the locked wine cellar, is that underneath every Mary in every household in England, there was a person who knew her own name, who thought in it, who perhaps dreamed in it, who wrote it in a diary late at night by candlelight after the house had finally gone still. They could not take the name from inside. They could only take the one that was spoken aloud. That distinction between what you carried in your interior life and what the household required of you on the surface is the thread that runs beneath everything in this story. Because the renaming was only the beginning. What came next were the rules about your time, your private life, and whether the people you loved were permitted, by the terms of your employment in the house where you lived and worked and slept, to exist in your life at all. There's something about the naming that takes on a different quality if you follow it all the way through. Think about what a name is, in practical terms. Not symbolically, but practically. Your name is the thing people use when they want your attention. It's what's written in parish records, in employment registers, in the back of books you've owned. It's the shorthand for a continuous self, the bridge between who you were as a child and who you are now. When someone uses your name, they're acknowledging in a quiet way that you have a history and that you're the same person who had it. When they use someone else's name, routinely, unthinkingly, as a matter of simple convenience, they're declining to make that acknowledgement. Multiply it by every day of a working life. Some women spent 15, 20, 30 years in the same household, answered to a name that wasn't theirs, and then left service and had to reintroduce themselves to a world that had never been in the habit of using their real one. There's a quiet strangeness to that, if you sit with it. Hannah Cullwick sat with it, and if that problem had been yours, you might have done the same by writing it down. The diaries weren't published in her lifetime. They were left, carefully, deliberately, to a collection that eventually found its way to Cambridge, where they've since become one of the foundational texts in the history of Victorian domestic service. She seems to have understood, in some part of herself, that they mattered, that the record of her days had a value she couldn't fully name but felt nonetheless. What she was doing was telling the truth about her own life, your life, in the same conditions. Night after night at the kitchen table with her pencil and a small notebook, was insisting, not loudly, not with any expectation of an audience, insisting in the only medium available to her that she had been here, that this was her life, and she had lived it, and it deserved to be accounted for in her own words. She used her real name in those pages, always, not the name the household used, her own, the one that was hers, that would have been your name in the same position, the one no rule could reach. The name they gave her at work, whatever the household required, was not the name she signed in her diary. And that distinction, maintained in private across 19 years, is perhaps the most quietly powerful act of self-preservation in the entire record of Victorian domestic life. It's easy from this distance to frame her life as pure hardship, relentless labour, relentless subordination, no room for your dignity or individual will. But that framing misses something important. Cullwick didn't experience her life as a tragedy, from what the diaries suggest. She found meaning in her work, took a genuine pride in physical competence, and resisted, repeatedly on her own terms, attempts to redefine her into something she didn't recognise. The rules were real, the constraints were real, and within them she was more fully herself than the system was designed to allow. The next time someone addresses you by the name you were given, the one that has always been yours, notice what that contains. The easy assumption that you are continuous, real, known. It costs nothing to use someone's actual name, and it turns out that small cost is precisely why so many Victorian households didn't bother. But there was something that went further than the renaming, something that reached deeper into a person's life and required more of them than answering to someone else every morning. It had a simple name of its own. They called it a follower. The word follower in Victorian domestic service meant specifically a romantic interest, a suitor, someone who was paying court to you, or wished to, or was simply a friend with whom there was any suggestion of something warmer than professional acquaintance. And in most households in Victorian England, a follower was forbidden, not discouraged, not frowned upon, forbidden. The rule was explicit, and it carried a consequence that was immediate and total. If you were found to have a follower, if a follower was discovered visiting you at the house or even meeting you regularly on your afternoons off, you could be dismissed that same day. No warning, no second conversation. You would leave the house where you worked and slept, and kept your single box of possessions, before the end of the afternoon. The practical logic from your employer's perspective was simple enough. A woman who needed her job was a woman your employer could count on. A servant with a romantic entanglement was a servant with divided attention. She might allow a visitor into the house. She might be distracted from her duties. She might introduce an unknown person into the domestic sphere. And above all, the concern that had never quite said aloud but was always present, a servant who became pregnant while in service was a problem of the first order. Discovery of pregnancy in an unmarried female servant meant dismissal, immediate that day. And what made this particularly devastating was the simultaneity of the losses it produced. In a single moment, and if this had been you, a moment you would never forget, a woman lost her job, her home, her income, and her reference, all at once, with no legal recourse and nowhere, in most practical senses, to go. The follower rule was less about propriety than about that outcome. The household didn't want to manage the consequences, and so it simply prohibited the cause. This shaped the servant's private life in ways that went well beyond romance. It affected whether anyone a servant knew and cared about was permitted to visit at all. A sister, a friend from home. In stricter households, even family members required the butler's or housekeeper's permission to be received. You were living in someone else's house, and in someone else's house, The people you loved had to ask permission to find you. In some houses, the rules about contact between male and female servants were almost as strict. In stricter establishments, conversation between footmen and housemaids was permitted only in the servants' hall, at meal times, within the hearing of the upper staff. Anything that suggested personal interest was a risk neither party could afford. You lived under the same roof, ate in the same room, passed each other in the same narrow corridors 12 times a day, and yet any warmth between you was formally forbidden. The upper servants knew it was impossible to enforce completely. They had been young themselves. They turned a blind eye to a great deal of it. But the rule existed, and the consequences of being caught on the wrong side of it were clear. You had 1 half-day off per week, in a well-run house, sometimes 1 full Sunday per month. This was the time that was technically your own, to spend as you chose, within limits, as long as you were back before the hour the housekeeper specified. It was in these hours that a follower might reasonably have expected to be seen, away from the house, in the ordinary world, in the public life that the house had effectively suspended. Picture what the half-day actually looked like, if you tried to inhabit it specifically. You left the house through the servants' entrance, the same way you came in. You walked up the area steps past the gate in the garden wall, and you emerged onto the street. The same street you could see from the basement window, from below, at an angle that showed you mostly feet and the lower halves of passers-by. From street level, it was different. You were one of those people now, for a few hours, walking at the same level as everyone else, your face in the open air, the sounds of the city arriving without the muffling effect of stone walls and closed doors, a cart, a horse, someone calling to someone across the road, the smell of bread from a bakery a few doors down. You were not in uniform. You were in your own clothes, the dress you'd chosen carefully within the limits of what the household considered appropriate, the hat you'd saved for, the shoes that were better than your working ones. You were, on the outside, a person on an afternoon in the city. No cap, no apron, no borrowed name following you down the street. For a few hours you could walk into a shop and be addressed as yourself. You could sit in a park and watch the pigeons without anyone needing anything from you. You could take a cup of tea in a tea room and sit at the table as long as you wanted without anyone ringing a bell. The housekeeper had specified what time you were to be back. You knew it exactly, the way you knew everything in that house exactly, by necessity, because forgetting it had consequences that you couldn't afford. But the hours between leaving and returning were genuinely yours, and what you did with them, who you saw, where you went, how you spent the small amount of money you'd managed to save from wages that were not large, those choices were your own, in a way that almost nothing else in the working week was. This was the half day, a few hours of ordinariness inside a life of structured management. Not a great freedom, but it was real, and in a life managed down to the hour, real was enough. But even that wasn't entirely private. If you met someone regularly on your half day, and the housekeeper became aware of it, that knowledge could follow you back inside. Your time off was yours. Your reputation, in the household's estimation, was still theirs. William Taylor understood this in a way that was specific and personal, because he was not dealing with the question of a follower in the ordinary sense. He was dealing with something even more structurally awkward. He was a footman. He was 30 years old. And he was married. Footmen in most Victorian households of any scale were expected to be unmarried. This was not a formal policy written into a contract. It was one of those unspoken structural expectations that the system ran on. The nature of the work required you to live in the house, to be available at the household's hours, and to present yourself in the family's rooms with your full attention and your person in perfect order. A wife and children existed outside this frame. By the logic of live-in service, they were a complication. William Taylor managed the complication by making himself into two people. His 1837 diary is not a dramatic document. It's a working man's record, practical, observational, occasionally wry, of a working man's year. He notes what he did, what the family did, what he ate, what the weather was. He notes his occasional frustrations, and he notes, when it happens, that he managed to get away to see his family. That's the phrase he uses. Managed to get away, and reading it now, you feel exactly how much it cost him to describe it that lightly. As though his wife and children were something he had to find time around, rather than something his life was organised toward. He went when he could. He took his afternoons and his rare, free mornings and made his way across London, and he sat with his wife and his children for whatever hours he had. And then he came back to the house, back to the bells and the silver and the livery and the family he served with the professional care his role required. The diary doesn't dwell on this. That's what stops you if you let it. He doesn't rage against the arrangement. He doesn't describe his longing in heightened language. He notes his visits the way he notes other practical facts, that he went, that he saw them, that he returned. The plainness of the record is exactly what makes it affecting. He had no expectation of an audience. He was simply keeping track of his own life, the way people keep track of things that matter to them, something that is yours in a way nothing else about your position is, and that they have no other way to hold on to. Two men lived inside William Taylor's working life. There was the footman, impeccably presented, trained to silence and deference, moving through the family's rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made himself functionally invisible. And there was the husband and father who managed to get away when he could, and came back and went to bed in a room that was not his home and not your home if you were in the same arrangement, behind a version of himself that no one in that house associated with anyone's wife or children. The household knew only the first man. It required only the first man. The second was something the footman carried privately, the way a person carries grief, not vanished, not set down, just quietly present in a way that doesn't show in the performance. This was not William Taylor's individual misfortune. It was an entirely predictable outcome of how the system was designed. Live-in service and private life were structurally incompatible, and the system had never been asked to reconcile them, because the people the system served had never needed to think about it. Here is the irony that Victorian England never quite named. Victorian England placed the family at the moral centre of everything. The home was considered sacred, and if you read the domestic writing of the era, you feel this immediately, not vaguely, not ornamentally, but in a deeply felt cultural way. The family hearth, the bond between husband and wife, the raising of children in a warm and ordered home. These were the values that Victorian moralists, novelists, clergymen and politicians all agreed on, passionately and repeatedly. Domesticity was not just pleasant, it was civilizing. It was the thing that made England England. The servants, your servants, if you had lived in that house, maintained those hearthside ideals physically and daily for families that weren't their own. They lit the fires in someone else's parlour. They kept someone else's children warm. They arranged someone else's furniture and polished someone else's silver and kept the domestic world of the Victorian home in the immaculate condition that allowed its occupants to feel that their home was a sanctuary. And in doing all of that, in the full, daily, faithful performance of that work, they were denied precisely what they were maintaining for others. Think about what that means for a moment. You keep the hearth for someone else. Your hearth doesn't exist, not as a side effect, as a condition of employment. There is a particular weight in that. Not the weight of cruelty. The people who designed this system didn't think of it as cruelty. The weight of indifference, which is its own thing entirely. They simply hadn't worked through what it would cost the people on the other side of the arrangement. Or they had, and decided it wasn't their concern. Both explanations are available. Neither one is comfortable. What the system regulated in the end was not just behaviour, it was imagination, the sense of oneself as someone with a future, with a private life, with a right to choose the people who shared it. All of that existed, technically, just beyond the edge of the employer's authority, but in practice the edge was very close. Your name was managed, your living space was managed, your visitors were managed, your time was managed, your relationships were managed. What was left was something smaller than a life and something larger than nothing. And in that space, contracted, surveilled, named by someone else, real people found ways to stay real. They wrote in small notebooks after everyone was asleep. They laughed in the kitchen when the upper servants weren't about. They kept their own name in a private place where no one could reach it. They found, in whatever ways were available to them, the thing every person eventually finds inside the strictest walls. And it's perhaps telling that the next rule, the one that tried most directly to prevent them, was the one about their voices. Imagine being in a room with other people, not a crowd, just the family at dinner, 3 or 4 at the table, the quiet sounds of an evening meal. You're in the room. You carry things in, set them down, remove them. You pour and step back and wait. You're as present in that room as anyone, and you are not permitted to speak, not because you have nothing to say, not because you've been asked to be quiet for a specific reason. You're not permitted to speak because initiating speech, placing your voice into the room without being directly invited to, is not part of what you are here to do. You are part of the room's function. You're not part of the room's conversation. The conduct manuals of the time stated this simply. A servant was not to speak unless spoken to, not to initiate conversation with the family or their guests, not to offer opinions, even when opinions had been solicited in some indirect way, not to volunteer information beyond what was specifically requested. In practice, this meant something that's genuinely difficult to inhabit from here. You could be spoken to, and you would answer. You could be asked a direct question and respond, briefly, plainly, without embellishment. You could be given instructions and confirm them. But the act of opening a conversation, of placing yourself into the speech of the room, that was closed to you. It wasn't your place. The phrase, knowing your place, has been drained by repetition of the specific content it once carried. In Victorian domestic service, knowing your place meant knowing exactly when your voice was permitted to exist in a shared space and when it was not. And the answer, much of the time, was that it was not. There's a physical discipline in this that's easy to underestimate. Staying silent in a room where you could speak isn't just not speaking. It requires a constant active suppression of every natural impulse to comment, respond, connect. You notice something interesting. You don't say so. You disagree with something heard at the table. You say nothing. You know the answer to the question being discussed. You stand there and know it, quietly, and wait. This was the professional standard. And like most professional standards that take on the quality of character over time, it was expected that you would absorb it so completely you no longer notice the effort. Beyond the prohibition on speaking, there was the prohibition on being heard at all. Moving without sound was part of the work itself. When you carried coals up the back stairs, they shouldn't rattle. When you laid a fire, the tongs shouldn't clatter against the grate. When you cleared the table, the china shouldn't ring. All of that auditory control, the management of every sound your body and your tools made in the course of a working day, was basic competence. Being heard was a small failure, but it was a failure. And laughing audibly, in a way that carried through a wall or up a staircase to where the family might conceivably hear it, was something else again. Being overheard laughing audibly in a way that carried through a wall or up a staircase to where the family might conceivably notice, could earn you a word from the housekeeper. Not a written censure, not a formal mark in any record. A word, cool and precise, arriving without warning at a moment when you were otherwise occupied. It registered the way a coal draft registers, immediately, completely, without ambiguity, and you didn't forget it. The expectation wasn't that servants didn't find things funny. The expectation was that their amusement, like their opinions and their voices and their presences in a corridor, was something to be managed. Grief followed the same logic in the opposite direction. A servant who wept visibly was a servant whose emotional state had intruded on the household's atmosphere. You were permitted your interior life. You simply weren't permitted to let it show where the family might encounter it. Think about what that requires of a person, over years. Your mother is ill. You received a letter this morning. You're currently clearing the breakfast things from the dining room while the family discusses their plans for the afternoon. Your face is not permitted to say what has just happened to you. Not forbidden in the sense that someone is watching closely enough to catch you, but forbidden in the sense that the standard you've absorbed across years of training tells you that your face is not entirely your own in this room. Your feelings are not the room's business. The correct posture is the one that gives nothing away. You've learned over time to inhabit your own face from the outside, to maintain its surface the way you maintain the room's surface, to present while working a version of yourself that is complete and orderly, and asks nothing of the people around you. This is not easy. It is in fact a sophisticated and sustained form of emotional labour, and it was expected of people who were often 14 years old when they entered service, who absorbed it before they had any framework for understanding what they were learning. There's a particular thing that happens when you suppress your own responses consistently and over a long time. Not numbness exactly. The diaries and letters that survive from below stairs describe people of considerable feeling and genuine wit, but a learned division between what exists inside and what is permitted to appear on the surface, a practiced gap between your inner weather and your outer presentation. The servants who managed this most completely were often described by their employers and by the household histories that survive as excellent servants, reliable, unobtrusive, perfectly trained. Let that settle for a moment. The highest professional compliment available to a servant was essentially a description of how thoroughly she had made herself invisible, how completely she had subordinated her visible self to the household's requirements. The excellence was in the disappearing. There was one more dimension to the silence rules that shaped your body, not just your voice, that went beyond speech and into where a servant was permitted to exist at all. In certain grand households, not the majority but documented clearly enough, Housemaids were expected not just to avoid speaking, but to avoid being seen, to step into a side room, or to press herself flat against a wall in a corner if the family appeared unexpectedly in a corridor, not simply to give room, to remove herself from the field of vision so completely that the encounter never technically happened. You were trained to do this quickly and without drawing attention to the disappearing itself. Vanishing without a visible vanishing. Stepping backward through a door and closing it quietly enough that the family's conversation never paused. Consider what that trains into a body, practiced daily over months and years. A constant low-level alertness to where the family is in the house, where you're in relation to them, whether the corridor ahead is navigable or requires a different route. An attunement to their specific footsteps, distinct from any other footsteps, that lets you anticipate and adjust before you're seen. This is the geography of a person who has been taught, through repeated instruction and repeated correction, that her presence outside of its functional context is an inconvenience. It was practiced by approximately 1.5 million people in Britain by 1891. That number deserves more than a mention. The census of that year recorded around 1.5 million domestic servants in England, making domestic service the single largest employment category in the country, larger than coal mining, larger in fact than any single industry you might name, larger than textile manufacture. More people went to work in other people's houses, followed the rules about the stairs and the silence and the names and the followers and the voices than did any other single category of work in Victorian England. 1.5 million trained silences, 1.5 million practiced disappearances, not because anyone thought this was kind, because the household needed to run, and this was how households ran, because your role in that running was assumed before you arrived and unchanged after you left. And the system had been operating this way long enough that it no longer required justification. But underneath every one of those trained silences there was a voice, and underneath every borrowed name, a real one, and underneath every learned disappearance, a person who went back to her room at night, cold, small in the attic above everything, and existed privately and fully in whatever way she could. That private existence was what the system couldn't fully reach. It tried, though. And the mechanism by which it tried most effectively wasn't the naming, or the follower rule, or the silence. It was something simpler. It was a piece of paper. A character was what they called a written reference. In Victorian domestic service, it was how your professional reputation travelled from one household to the next. When you left a position, by choice or by dismissal, the employer's opinion of your conduct, your honesty and your temperament was rendered into a letter. That letter was your character. You carried it to your next interview. The new employer read it before deciding whether to take you on. Without a character you couldn't work. This was not a soft statement. In a domestic service market where every employer asked for a character and every reputable registry office required one before placing you, the absence of a reference was close to the end of the road. Servants without characters didn't get positions. Servants without positions had no income. Servants with no income and no home, since their home had been their employer's house, had very few places to go. The workhouse was the end of that particular path. Here is the thing most people don't know about this system. There was no legal requirement for an employer to provide a character. None. A servant who was dismissed, for any reason or for no reason, had no legal right to a written reference. The employer could decline to write one, write something devastatingly brief, or write nothing at all. The servant had no formal recourse. She couldn't demand it. She couldn't sue for it. She could ask, politely, and accept whatever response came. Your future, in other words, depended entirely on the goodwill of the person currently paying your wages. The Servants' Characters Act of 1792 sounds, on first hearing, like it might protect against this. It doesn't. The Act criminalised fraudulent references. It made it illegal to forge a character, or to write a deliberately false one. But it placed no obligation on an employer to write a true one. The law protected the system from fraud. It offered the servant nothing. What this meant in practice was that the threat of dismissal without a character was the most effective single mechanism of compliance available to any employer. It required no cruelty, no spectacular punishment. It simply existed as a possibility, always present, never quite discussed. And that presence alone was enough to keep a household's rules running with very little enforcement. You could be dismissed without warning, without a character, without anything beyond whatever wages were legally owed, and you would walk out of the house that had been your home, carrying your one box of possessions and facing a conversation about how to survive the next month with no reference, no residence, and no legal recourse of any kind. This happened. Regularly. Quietly. The women it happened to are largely absent from the historical record. They left the system, and the system's record doesn't follow people who have nothing left to document. What survives comes mostly from the edges: workhouse records, charity ledgers, occasional newspaper items reporting cases that were extreme enough to attract attention. The ordinary cases, the ones that happened without drama, were simply absorbed into the background of Victorian poverty. They controlled where you went, and what you said, and who you saw, and what you were called. They controlled your next employer, and your income, and your future. And through all of that, through the letters and the bells and the silence and the rules, there was one more thing they controlled that was as close and as daily and as physical as anything else. They controlled what you wore. The uniform was not a choice. In most households that employed more than 2 or 3 servants, the dress required of each role was specified by the household and enforced by the housekeeper. For a housemaid during morning work, this meant a plain working dress, cotton or wool in dark colours, with a white apron and a white cap. The cap was not optional. It was not decorative in any personal sense. It was a marker of your role, and your role required that your hair be covered while you worked. For afternoon, when the family might receive visitors and you might appear in the public rooms, there was a different dress. Slightly better fabric, a cleaner apron, the same cap. The distinctions between morning and afternoon dress were small, but they were specified. The housekeeper noticed when they weren't observed. Footmen had livery. The formal uniform marked them as belonging to a specific household, often in the family's colours, with silver or brass buttons bearing the family's crest. The livery was provided by the employer, fitted by the employer's tailor, and was the employer's property. When a footman left service, he left the livery behind. This meant something specific. The most formal clothing a footman ever wore in his working life was not his. It was a costume he inhabited on behalf of the family, made to their specifications, returned to them when no longer needed, not your property. His own clothes, the ones that were actually his, the way your clothes are yours, the ones he wore on his half-days off, the ones that were genuinely his, were whatever he could afford on wages that were not large. The rules about personal appearance in uniform were specific and firm. No jewellery, not a ring, not a brooch, not a small pin at the collar. Any personal adornment was considered inconsistent with the uniform, and the uniform was meant to signal function, not identity. Adornment signalled identity. Identity was not the point. Hair covered during working hours, for men in formal service, powdered for grand occasions. For women, always under a cap, always neat, always invisible in the sense of not drawing attention to itself. And then there was the broader principle that governed everything. You are not to dress above your station. This phrase appears repeatedly in the household manuals and conduct books of the Victorian era. It means something more specific than it sounds. It means that your clothing, at all times, should signal your social position and not aspire to signal anything above it. A housemaid who arrived for her new position wearing a dress that was too good, too fine of fabric, too expressive of taste, was making a claim her role didn't support. That claim could be enough to worry the housekeeper, who might begin to wonder whether this person truly understood her circumstances. In some documented cases, servants were dismissed for dressing above their station on their days off, not in the household's presence, on their own time, in their own clothes, on the street, where someone from the household happened to see them. The offence was considered real regardless of where it was committed. Think about what that means. Your Sunday best, the dress you saved for your half-day, the outfit you wore to church or to visit your mother, had to sit within a range the household considered appropriate for someone of your position. Not too plain to be embarrassing, not too fine to be presumptuous. The correct degree of visible aspiration, legible on the outside of your body, even when you weren't being paid. What you wore at work was determined by work. What you owned outside of it, what was truly, unambiguously yours, was contained in a single wooden box. Not a trunk, not a chest of drawers, a box, under your bed, in your room, in the attic above the family's life. Everything a Victorian servant owned of a personal nature. Letters, small keepsakes, a spare dress, perhaps a book, a photograph if she had one, whatever small objects had accumulated across years of service, fitted into this box. The room itself was attic, typically. Cold in winter in a way the family's rooms were not. Small, often shared. A narrow bed, a washstand with a basin and a jug, a single window, frequently ungenerous. No fireplace. She spent her working days managing fires, lighting them, maintaining them, cleaning them, carrying the coal that kept them burning in the rooms of people who slept warmly. And in her own room, not your room, in every possible way. At the end of that day, there was no fire. The cold sat in the walls the way it sat in the basement corridor on a January morning, and she lay down in it and she slept, because the bells began again before 5, and there was no point in anything that delayed sleep. Reading material was permitted in some households and restricted in others. The Bible was always acceptable. Novels were more complicated. Some employers had no opinion. Others felt that fiction cultivated expectations inconsistent with the servant's actual circumstances. The logic was rarely stated in those terms, but that was its shape. This is the whole of the private life, then, when you've accounted for all of it. A cold attic room, a box under the bed, a half-day per week. A name that was yours in private and someone else's in public. 1.5 million people in the 1891 census. 1.5 million boxes under 1.5 million beds. When you hold the scale alongside the individual detail, when you think 1.5 million people and a wooden box in the same breath, something shifts in how the whole picture looks. Domestic service was not a marginal feature of Victorian society, it was central to it. Without servants, the great houses didn't run, the dinner parties didn't happen, the elaborate social machinery of Victorian public life. The visits, the calling cards, the seasonal schedules, the children raised in ordered homes. None of it was possible without the labour of people who couldn't maintain the same order in their own lives. And in your life below stairs, you saw this more clearly than anyone. It was estimated that by the late Victorian era, 1 in 3 working women in England was in some form of domestic service. 1 in 3. Think about what that means. In any gathering of working women in Victorian England, 1/3 of them went home, if they went home at all, rather than back to their employer's house, to a version of what we've been describing: the cap, the borrowed name, the box, the cold room. If that had been your life, your cap, your borrowed name, your box, you would have been one of those 1.5 million. It was not an edge case. It was the centre of working life for Victorian women, and yet, and this is what matters, the system couldn't quite contain what it created. Victorian servants discovered and used an outlet that was perfectly suited to their situation. It required no name. It left no trail back to any specific household or any specific person. The anonymous letter. From the middle of the Victorian era onward, the letters pages of working class and general newspapers carried regular anonymous correspondence from domestic servants, your counterparts, writing what you would have written, not scandal, something quieter, observations, dry complaints, the occasional sharply worded account of an employer's particular unreasonableness. They described employers who docked wages for crockery the servant hadn't broken, housekeepers who applied the rules to everyone except their favourites, the follower rule enforced against women while men in the same household received no such restriction. They wrote it all anonymously, because they had to, because a named complaint could follow you to your next employer, and the character system meant that anonymity was the only form of candour available. These letters are not in the major histories of the Victorian era. They're in newspaper archives, in collections of ephemera, in the back pages of publications that no longer exist. But they're there, and they suggest something the official record of domestic service tends to understate. The people below stairs had opinions, and they found ways to express them. The kitchen itself was a place where some of your opinions circulated carefully in the open. The rule against laughing audibly said nothing about laughing in the kitchen between servants when no one above stairs was listening. The rule against offering opinions to the family said nothing about the opinions that ran along the servants' table in low voices, about the family's habits, their guests, their eccentricities, the gap between their public and private conduct. There was an interior culture below stairs that the households employing servants were almost entirely unaware of. A running commentary, one that, if you had been part of it, would have felt like the one genuinely free thing in an otherwise managed day, conducted in whatever space existed between the official version of service and the human reality of it. The family didn't hear it. The housekeeper caught only fragments, but it was warm and consistent and entirely its own, like the diary written late at night, like the real name kept in private, like the fire settling quietly in the grate at the end of a long day, the last task done, the house finally still you, the servant finally alone. That image, the fire settling, the room dark, the day complete, is one worth holding on to, because we've spent a great deal of time now inside the rules and the restrictions and the machinery of a world built around other people's comfort. And it's worth asking at this point what any of it adds up to, not from the outside, not from the history books, but from the inside of the life itself. The question isn't a simple one, but the evidence points toward an answer that might surprise you. What Victorian servants found to hold on to inside a life arranged almost entirely around someone else's needs was not, in the main, bitterness. It was skill. It was community. It was the very particular dignity that exists in doing something difficult, doing your job, and doing it well day after day in conditions that didn't invite you to feel good about the work, and by extension, about yourself, in a way that belonged entirely to you. The cooking is an example, not just cooking as a professional matter, but the fact that within the kitchen, within the world of the range and the stock pot and the pastry board, there was expertise of a genuine and specific kind. A woman who had spent 20 years as a cook in a good household, your household in this story, knew things about food and preparation and technique that would take another 20 years to fully transmit. She had a craft, and the craft was hers in a way that the house wasn't, and the uniform wasn't, and the name she answered to wasn't. The same was true of a skilled lady's maid. The specific knowledge, your craft, if it had been your trade, of how to dress a woman's hair in the current fashion, how to press a silk dress so the creases fell exactly where they should, how to manage a mistress's wardrobe through a full London season without a single item going astray. These were skills. They took years to develop, and in acquiring them, a servant had something that no one could rename or redefine. Below stairs, the friendships that formed in those shared spaces were real and often lasting. The servants' hall was a place where people ate together 3 times a day, every day for as long as they were in the same household. If that had been your kitchen, a place of shared effort, shared heat, and shared exhaustion. The laundry, where the maids worked through enormous quantities of linen with an efficiency that impresses even at this distance, was a place where conversation was possible in a way it wasn't upstairs. The noise of the work, the distance from the family, gave some room to breathe. In these spaces, servants observed each other closely. They knew each other's habits and tempers and histories in the particular intimate way that comes from sharing small quarters and long hours. They covered for each other when it was possible. They warned each other about the housekeeper's mood, your mood, if she was your housekeeper, about which tasks were being inspected more carefully than usual, about which family members were best avoided on a given morning. They saved each other small trouble and registered, even without naming it, each other's humanity. This community below stairs is mostly invisible in the official history. It left very few formal traces, but in the diaries and letters that survive, in Hannah Cullwick's notebooks, in William Taylor's matter-of-fact entries, in the occasional memoir that found its way into print, it appears consistently in the background of the working day as the thing that made the working day survivable. You had a companion who knew your actual name. You had a colleague who took the coal hod from you when your arms were giving out without being asked, because she'd been there too. You had, in the kitchen at the end of a long evening, 5 minutes of laughter that nobody upstairs could hear and nobody below stairs would repeat. That was yours. Whatever the household controlled, it did not control that. There were also the grey areas, the soft boundaries of the rules that every servant learned and most employers half expected would be bent. The most common of these involved food. In most households there was an understanding, unspoken, never formalized, that the kitchen produced more than it quite accounted for. A cook who had access to the pantry was a cook who could make sure the servants' table was slightly better supplied than the official budget suggested. A kitchen maid who ate while she worked was taking something that wasn't technically hers. And if that had been your kitchen, your hunger, your long morning, you would probably have done the same. In practice, most housekeepers registered this and chose not to see it, because a hungry kitchen maid was a slower kitchen maid, and the household's interests were best served by a staff that was adequately fed. These small compromises were not corruption. They were the system making room for itself, acknowledging in the only language available to it that the official terms of service were not quite equal to what was being asked. The servants who navigated these grey areas with the greatest skill understood, without being told, exactly how much was being seen and how much was being overlooked. Too little, and you were hungry. Too much, and you were dismissed. The correct quantity of invisible adjustment required exactly the calibration that every other aspect of the job required. Knowing your place included knowing how much room your place had in it. And underneath all of it, underneath the community and the craft and the quiet grey areas and the kitchen laughter, was the simple accumulation of time. Every year in a good household, every year without a dismissal, every year with a solid character, was a year of experience that made the next position slightly easier to find. You were learning all the time a world that was hostile to your learning anything, because learning was a form of self-improvement, and self-improvement was the kind of ambition the system wasn't designed to accommodate. But it happened anyway. People improved, people became expert, people left one household and found a better one, with higher wages, with more reasonable hours, with a housekeeper who was less interested in policing the laughter in the kitchen. The movement was slow and not available to everyone. The scullery maid at 13 and the scullery maid at 43, if that had been your trajectory, who had never moved past the first rung, were the same system but a very different experience. But the movement was there, and the system was not, in the end, as total as it appeared. The household controlled the stairs and the name and the costume and the voice and the future. It did not control everything. What it could not control, what no system of rules has ever successfully controlled, including no rule applied to you in your own life, was what a person thought about in the cold attic room at the end of a long day, in the last few minutes before sleep, when the house was finally quiet and the only presence was their own. They thought about the same things people have always thought about at the end of difficult days, their families, their futures, the particular satisfactions of the day's work and the particular indignities of it, the person they were going to write to on their half day, the thing the housekeeper had said that still rankled 3 hours later. They thought about the fire settling in the grate, not as metaphor, as practical reality. The last task of the evening often was banking the kitchen fire, reducing it to a slow burn, adding the overnight coal, closing the damper so it would hold until morning. You knelt in front of it for a minute, perhaps two, and watched it settle. The coals shifted and compressed, the orange moving through them in slow patterns. The room cooled slightly around you as the fire drew in on itself. That was the end of the day. That moment was yours, those specific 2 minutes before you rose and went to bed. In a life with very few things to call your own, a moment is not nothing. Something was changing in the world outside the household walls, though, changing in your direction, eventually, though you might not have lived to see it, slowly, incrementally, in ways that took decades to become visible, and then, with the arrival of a single catastrophic event, all at once. The Victorian domestic service world didn't decline gradually into retirement. It was shattered, very quickly, by the First World War. By the early 1900s, there were already signs of strain. Employers complained with increasing frequency about the difficulty of finding good servants. The servant problem, the sense that the supply of willing domestic workers was contracting, was a regular topic in newspapers and in letters pages. Employers wondered what had happened to your predecessors, the reliable, well-trained servants of previous decades. What had happened was that other options that would have been available to you had you been born 30 years later, were beginning to exist. The expansion of clerical work, of shop work, of factory work in the later Victorian and Edwardian periods meant that working-class women, for the first time, had alternatives that didn't require living in someone else's house, answering to someone else's name, and being subject to someone else's household rules 24 hours a day. The alternatives paid less in some cases. They came with their own difficult conditions. But they offered something domestic service, by definition, could not. They offered the end of the working day. When your factory shift or your shop hours concluded, you left. You walked out. You went home. To your own room, your own name, your own evening, your own decisions about how to spend the hours between the end of work and sleep. That was new, and once it existed as an option, domestic service became harder to choose. Then 1914 arrived, and the calculus changed overnight. Women entered munitions factories, nursing, the postal service, farming, transport work. They drove ambulances. They ran farms that their husbands had left to enlist. They discovered, in the emergency of a wartime economy, that they were capable of work that no one had previously invited them to do. And when the war ended, if that had been your war, many of them declined the invitation to go back. The great houses found, in the years following 1918, that their staffing problems were no longer a matter of finding good servants. The servants weren't there. The women who had left service for war work came home to something domestic service couldn't offer: the memory of being outside, of having done something large, of having been somewhere that used their full capacities. Some returned because they had to. If your alternatives had dried up, you came back, because the economy contracted again and the options narrowed. But the number returning was smaller than the number who had left, and the generation that followed was the one that would watch domestic service become, over the following decades, a slowly shrinking fraction of the working world. The world below stairs was ending, not dramatically, not with a great reckoning, just quietly, one departure at a time, your predecessors leaving generation by generation for a world the household couldn't offer, with the quiet diminishment of a system that the people it depended on had finally found ways to leave. The rules didn't change, not in your lifetime and not in theirs. The character system didn't change. The front stairs were still not for the servants. But there were fewer servants to use the back stairs, and the ones who remained knew in some part of themselves that the world outside the house was different now, that the door they'd always entered through the side could, if it came to it, be the door they left through for good. What are we left with when we've followed all of this to its end? There is something that takes time to arrive at when you've traced the rules of Victorian domestic service this far through. You've seen the architecture and the hierarchy and the naming and the silence and the character system and the cold attic rooms and the single box. You've seen the system in its full detail, what it required, what it controlled, what it couldn't quite reach. And then the system ended, their houses emptied of their staffs. The women who had been Mary for 20 years became themselves again, or discovered they'd always been themselves and were simply called something else for a while. What remains? The diaries remain. Hannah Cullwick's notebooks, 19 years of mornings described with extraordinary precision. William Taylor's 1837 journal, your best window into a footman's interior life, plain and practical and quietly affecting in the way that plain practical things can be. The anonymous letters in newspaper archives, signed with whatever pseudonym the writer felt safe behind. The servants' rules themselves, preserved in conduct manuals and household guides, which are strange to read now, not because they were written in a foreign language, but because they describe a set of human arrangements so specific and so total, arrangements that, if applied to your life, would be unrecognizable, that it takes your full imagination to believe they were, for so many people, simply a Tuesday. These documents preserve something important. Not just the facts, not just the rules and the wages and the hierarchies. They preserve the texture of a daily life, the physical experience of carrying coal up a back staircase at 4 a.m. in January, the specific quality of silence in a dining room when the servants are present but not addressed, the weight of a key ring on a housekeeper's belt. Texture is what disappears first from history. Facts survive, dates survive, names survive sometimes. But what it felt like to move through a specific set of rooms with a specific set of rules operating on your body and your voice and your name, that disappears quickly, because the people who knew it firsthand didn't always record it. The servants who wrote it down gave us something rare. They gave us a way back into the interior of a world the official record mostly chose not to see. And what that interior shows, if you follow it carefully, is people who were, in a full and genuine sense, alive inside those conditions. Not despite the conditions, not in heroic opposition to them, simply alive in the way people are alive when the alternative isn't on offer. Thinking, feeling, remembering, hoping, in whatever dimension hope can exist in a life where the morning routine begins before 5 and the last task before sleep is banking the kitchen fire. That is not a small thing to preserve. It is the thing that matters most. And it's the thing that brought you here tonight. We know the rules because the rules were written down. We know the wages because wages were recorded. We know the census number, 1.5 million, because the census required it. But we know what any of it felt like only because specific people, with specific names and specific handwriting, decided to put it in words and keep it somewhere. And reading those words now, you feel the weight of that decision. Hannah Cullwick left her diaries with the clear sense that they should survive. She wrote in them across 19 years. She described the coal and the grate and the slops and the boots and the stairs. She signed them with her real name, and in doing so she performed a kind of act that the system was specifically designed to prevent. She made herself permanent. The household could call her Mary or not name her at all. It could, and in your world, if you had been her it would have. It could require her silence and regulate her uniform and prevent her from using the front stairs. It could give her a cold room and a wooden box and a half-day per week. It could not make her forget herself. That, as small as it sounds, may be the most important thing in the whole record of Victorian domestic service, and it speaks directly to your own life if you follow it. Not the numbers, not the character system, not the architectural design of the back stairs, the simple, persistent, unremarkable fact that underneath every regulation and every borrowed name and every trained silence, there was someone who knew exactly who they were. They knew it in the kitchen, in the laughter between tasks. They knew it in the diary, in the sentences written after everyone else was asleep. They knew it in the moment at the end of the working day, when they knelt in front of the kitchen fire and banked it down for the night, and watched the coals settle and were, for those 2 minutes, in that warm, narrowing light, entirely themselves. There's something else worth pausing for, before we let this world go. When the servant class diminished after the First World War, something was genuinely lost. Not something you'd necessarily name on first consideration, but real. Something belonging not to the employers who struggled to fill their households, but to the servants themselves, the craft, the community, the very specific knowledge that had accumulated across generations, how to run a house of a certain scale, how to manage its supplies and its staff and its seasonal rhythms, how to press a silk dress and arrange a formal table, and move through a grand house without disturbing the air of it. This knowledge was transmitted person to person, your knowledge, passed from the woman before you, an older housemaid teaching a younger one, a cook passing her methods to the kitchen maid who worked beside her for 5 years, a lady's maid showing a girl half her age, and if that girl had been you, in different circumstances, the specific fold of a morning wrapper, the correct angle of a dressing table mirror, knowledge that lived in someone's hands, not in your hands or mine. When the staffs dispersed, when the women left for factories and offices and didn't come back, much of that knowledge dispersed with them. Not entirely, not forever, but in ways that took decades to recover. The things that were gained were real and significant. Freedom of movement, control of one's own hours, the right to live in one's own home, the right to answer to one's own name, the right to have a private life without permission, to receive a visitor without asking, to laugh audibly at whatever hour seemed appropriate. These are not trivial gains, but the people who had those things taken from them were also real, and the fact that the taking was structural, done by a system and not by identifiable villains, doesn't change the weight of it for you if you had been one of those individuals. 1.5 million in 1891, each one with a box under a bed somewhere, each one with a name they answered to in public and a name they kept in their own thoughts, each one managing every day the exact distance between what the household required and what they privately held on to. 1.5 million fires banked for the night. 1.5 million mornings when the person who banked them rose before the house was awake and started again. That repetition, that faithfulness to a schedule not of their own making across years and sometimes decades, is the thing that doesn't fully compute from the outside. Not just the work, but your daily renewal of the decision, if it had been you, to continue, to get up before 5 again, to carry the coal again, to answer to Mary again. Whatever kept people in service, necessity, habit, the absence of alternatives, genuine pride in the work, the specific community of it, the strange safety of a world whose rules, however hard, were at least known. Whatever it was, it produced in the people it worked on a kind of endurance that history tends to list as a fact and pass by too quickly. That endurance deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. And if you feel the weight of this story tonight, that's what you're acknowledging. It's what Hannah Cullwick was recording every night at the kitchen table. Not just what she did, but the fact of her continuing to do it. Not just the rules, but the person who navigated them day after day across 19 years and sat down at the end of each one to account for herself in her own words, in the same quiet way, perhaps, that you're listening to this account now. She wrote the last diary entry in 1873. She lived until 1909. We don't know what those final 36 years look like from the inside. Whatever she thought in the early mornings, in the cold corridors, in the minutes before the fire was lit, that's gone. But the 19 years remain, specific, detailed, warm in their particular way, the warmth of an honest account of an honest life. And that is enough. There's a reason stories like this one have a particular quality in the night hours. Something about the long, quiet house, Something about the fires laid in rooms where everyone is sleeping, and the person who laid them moving back through the dark to their own room. You're in your room now. It's warm, presumably, in a way that hers was not. The rules governing your evening, what you do with your time, who you're permitted to speak to, what name you answer to, those are your own, negotiated with no one. That is not a small thing. It took a very long time to arrive at, and it arrived on the backs of people who didn't fully have it, who carried it quietly, in the private part of themselves that no household could reach, and passed it forward to a world they didn't live to see. Somewhere in a notebook in a Cambridge archive, a woman named Hannah is still writing by candlelight, still accounting for herself in her own words, still signing her real name in the last minutes of the day when no one is watching and the house, your house for now, not your own, is finally still. The fire in the kitchen is settling, slowly, steadily, the coals going quieter as the room goes dark. Let the house be still for a moment. It's late now. The family's evening is over. The last lamp turned down, the last door closed, the last bell rung. The footman has retired to his room. The upper servants are in their beds. The kitchen maid is asleep in the room she shares with the scullery maid. 2 narrow beds against 2 narrow walls. The window dark. You're the last one standing in the kitchen. The range is settled. You've closed it down for the night. The damper adjusted, the coals reduced to their slow, overnight burn, enough to carry the heat through until morning when you'll build it back up. The kitchen is dimmer than it was an hour ago. It's the warmest room in the house, and now the most quiet. The work finally done. You've been awake since before 4 this morning. The day has passed through you the way a long day passes, not in a single continuous memory, but in fragments. The cold of the back stairs in the dark, the weight of the coal hod, the particular silence of the mistress's bedroom as you laid the fire with her asleep 3 feet away. Breakfast, the bells, the afternoon's demands, the servants' hall at dinner, the low voices, the upper servants leaving before pudding, the evening routine, the last tasks, and now this, the kitchen, in the dark, the house quiet above you. Your real name is in your diary. It's in the letters you write home on your half-days. It's in the part of you that exists in the small hours, in the room above this kitchen, in the 2 minutes before sleep. It's yours. It has always been yours. The house at night is different from the house during the day. During the day it is a performance, every room arranged, every surface maintained, every person in their place. At night the performance is suspended. The rooms that you cleaned this morning are simply rooms now, no one requiring them to be anything, no one moving through them, no one watching. There is something peaceful in a house at this hour, once you know it well enough to move through it in the dark without thinking. The hall is cool. The carpet on the main staircase is a darker rectangle in the dimness, the banister a faint line of polished wood catching nothing. You make your way to the back stairs, which you know by feel, the width of them, the particular creak on the 3rd step, the angle of the landing where the single window sits. You've made this trip thousands of times. You stopped counting years ago. At the top, the air is colder. The servants' attic loses its warmth quickly. The walls here are plaster and lath, and the cold of the outside moves through them freely. Your room is at the end of the corridor. The door opens without sound. Inside, the narrow bed, the washstand, the window, the box. You sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, not thinking particularly. Just existing in the small space before sleep makes existing unnecessary. The day sits behind you in its fragments. Tomorrow sits ahead in its familiar shape. The fire, the coal, the stairs, the bells, the family's mourning, the long arc of another day. And for now, in this space between them, you are simply here. This is the part of the day that no rule reaches. This is yours. The silence in this room is different from the silence required of you downstairs. That silence was a performance, a managed absence of sound, held in place by training and consequence and the ever-present weight of the character that could be withheld without reason. This silence is simply what happens when no one is asking anything of you. It is the silence of a person who's been working since before dawn and is now, finally, permitted to stop. History is not made of systems, it is made of mornings, each one specific, each one cold in January in the dark before the family woke, each one begun by a person with her own name and her own history and her own interior life, all of it compressed, all of it managed, all of it available to be written down or not written down and simply lived, which is what most of it was, simply lived. There is one more thing worth carrying into the quiet, and it speaks directly to your experience of hearing all of this tonight. Among all the rules and restrictions that governed Victorian domestic service, there was one quality that the rules were intended to produce, but that the people inside them produced differently than intended. The rules intended to produce invisibility. What the people inside them produced was, in many cases, a precise and sophisticated attention to the world, an attentiveness that comes specifically from having to read a room's atmosphere before entering it, from having to understand without being told what the household needed at any given moment. You watched the family. You understood their rhythms before they fully understood them themselves. You knew when the master's mood was difficult before he'd said a word, and you adjusted accordingly. You knew when the mistress was unwell before she'd rung for anyone. You knew which floorboards announced themselves, which doors needed a specific pressure to close without sound, which draught came from the east window in the hall, and how to walk past it so the papers didn't move. This knowledge lived in your body. It belonged to the specific geography of this specific house, accumulated through the specific repetition of your specific days. It is yours in the deepest sense. The servants understood the households they worked in with the depth that the households rarely understood themselves. They are inside the machinery. They knew where the problems were, and what they did with that knowledge was mostly hold it privately, where no character letter and no housekeeper and no follower rule could reach it. A woman who spent 30 years in service, who navigated the rules and the hierarchies and the cold rooms, your room, in her shoes, and came through it with her sense of herself intact, understood things about human nature that no drawing-room education could have taught her. She'd been inside the structure. She had seen it from the side that made it run. That understanding was hers. No one could take it. It went with her into sleep every night, and was waiting in the morning along with the fire and the cold and the back stairs and the bells. The fire in the kitchen will hold through the night. You have made sure of it. In the morning you'll go down the back stairs and open the damper and rebuild it. You'll do it in the dark, in silence, before anyone above you opens their eyes. The house will be warm when they wake. The breakfast will be ready. The day will begin as days begin, with no acknowledgement of what it cost to bring them to that point. But you will know. You always know. Think for a moment about the word enough. It is not a triumphant word. It doesn't suggest abundance or vindication. It suggests exactly what it says, the right amount. What is needed. and no more. The life we've walked through tonight was enough for the people living it. Not enough in the sense that they deserved no more. They deserved considerably more. But enough in the sense that it contained what a human life contains. Work that had meaning, even when the system didn't acknowledge the meaning. People who mattered, even when the rules required them to be invisible. A self that persisted, even when the household gave it a different name. A life lived fully inside very narrow walls is still a life fully lived. That is what the diaries say, if you read them slowly enough. Not between the lines, in the lines themselves, in the specific weight of a coal hod, in the particular creak of the third step on the back staircase, in the name signed at the bottom of the page, in pencil, in the last light of the day. That image, the fire burning low, the day behind you, is one we will return to. But first, one more thing worth knowing about the shape of those days. A day in your life in service had a particular shape. Not a random accumulation of tasks, but a specific, sequential, timed architecture. Your day before it was the family's day. The same each weekday, varied slightly on weekends, adjusted for the seasons, but fundamentally the same across the years. Here is how it went. At 4 in the morning, or at the very latest 4:30, the earliest rising servant, usually the scullery maid or the most junior housemaid, was expected to be out of bed. There was no alarm in most households. There was instead the knowledge that rising late had consequences, and that knowledge, absorbed quickly and retained indefinitely, served as its own reliable mechanism. Your first task of the morning was the kitchen fire. Not building it from cold, that would take too long. Banking it had been the last task of the previous night, and banking meant reducing it to a slow burn that would hold through the dark hours. The first task of the morning was to open it back up, to add coal, to coax it from its slow overnight pulse back into a fire that could heat water, drive the range, and produce a kitchen capable of functioning by the time the cook, your superior in the kitchen hierarchy, arrived. While the kitchen fire was being rebuilt, the first lamps were being lit. The house ran on oil lamps and candles through much of the Victorian era, and the lamps needed trimming and refilling on a regular cycle. The general illumination of the working areas below stairs fell to whoever was first up. By 5, the housemaids had to be in the family's rooms, not during the family's occupancy, before it. The early morning was the only time to clean a room that would be occupied throughout the day. You moved through the bedrooms while the family was still asleep, sometimes with them visibly asleep, the shape of them under the covers, the sound of their breathing. You cleaned the grate, you laid the new fire, you dusted the surfaces, you withdrew without sound before anyone needed to acknowledge you had been there. The breakfast preparations began in earnest at 6, sometimes earlier. Breakfast in a Victorian household of any scale was not a simple meal. It was a production. Kidneys and kedgeree and eggs in multiple preparations and toast and preserves and fresh bread and coffee and tea, served at specific times in specific vessels, maintained at specific temperatures, presented in a specific sequence. The cook managed the production. The kitchen maid, your role, if you started at the bottom, assisted. The footman transferred the result to the dining room. While the family ate, your employers, their routine. The servants who weren't serving were continuing the morning's cleaning. The public rooms had to be swept and dusted and readied before anyone wanted to use them. This happened in the hours between the families rising and their dispersal into their morning routines. The bells began in earnest by 9. The bell system, a row of labelled bells in the servants' hall, each connected by wire to a pull in a specific room, was the primary mechanism of communication between family and staff. A bell rang. You looked at the indicator. You went where the indicator pointed. You received the instruction and returned. The bells could ring at any time, for any purpose the family found necessary. They were not to be ignored. Dinner at midday. The servants' dinner at the same time or shortly after. Perhaps 40 minutes. Not optional time off, simply the gap between the morning's tasks and the afternoon's. Tea was served at 4 or 5. The evening's preparation began immediately after tea. Fires replenished. The dining room prepared for dinner. The silver polished if needed. The footman changed into formal dress. Dinner, the evening meal, at 7 or 8 in a fashionable household. The service of a formal dinner was a different kind of work. It was a performance, one that required your full, sustained attention for the duration. Each course was timed, each piece of silverware placed in its precise position. The footman served from the left, removed from the right, poured with specific technique, maintained their positions with the stillness that was itself a form of discipline. The family's evening after dinner, in the drawing room or the library, required servants available but invisible, lamps maintained, fires stoked, anything needed, available immediately, anything not needed, absent. By 10 or 11 the family retired. The clearing of the evening began. The dining room, the drawing room, whatever had been used, returned to order. The silver locked away. The last lamps turned down, and at the very end, your last task, the kitchen fire, banked for the night. The whole arc, from before 5 in the morning to 11 or later, was the servants' day. 6 days a week, with Sunday varied by household. 1 half-day per week in the most generous arrangements. This was not exceptional. This was the schedule. The conduct manuals were specific about what this schedule required of the servant's character. Not just the physical execution of tasks. Those could be taught. The manuals were interested in something less tangible. The servant was to be honest. Not only that she should not steal, though also that a servant caught stealing faced immediate dismissal and sometimes criminal prosecution. She was to be honest about her capacities, her previous positions, her reasons for leaving. Your capacities in this system were assessed before you ever walked through the door. She was not to lie in small ways. The servant was to be sober. Intoxication was a fireable offence. The access that servants had to the household stores, the butler to the wine cellar, the footman to the decanters, made this a practical concern as much as a moral one. Temptation was available. Resistance was required. The servant was to be modest, not gossiping about the family's business, not sharing information about their finances or habits or private conversations, not drawing attention to herself in ways the household considered inconsistent with her position, which, if you follow it fully, means not drawing attention to herself at all. And, in the phrase that recurs across every manual and every guide from the era, she was to be respectful. Respectful was the word that contained all the others. It meant the correct posture of body and voice and gaze in the presence of those above her. It meant not challenging, not questioning, not drawing attention to inconveniences unless directly asked. It meant inhabiting the role fully, presenting it cleanly, and giving the household no cause to think she was anywhere other than entirely committed to its smooth operation. It meant, in the final analysis, being good at appearing to want the life she'd been given. The manuals understood the distinction, your willingness versus your trained performance of willingness, even if they didn't phrase it that way. They knew that training produced the appearance of willingness. They preferred the appearance. It was more comfortable. What the people inside the training preferred, what they actually wanted in the cold attic room, in the kitchen before 5, in the diary written after everyone was asleep, was a different and larger thing. One thing the manuals never addressed was what to do with pride. Not the pride that led to defiance. That was addressed firmly under impertinence. But the quieter, more complicated pride that a skilled and experienced servant might feel in work done to a high standard. The specific satisfaction of a well-laid fire, one that you laid, one that was burning well, one that is burning well because of something you did, a well-set table, a house running at its best on an ordinary Thursday when nothing was exceptional except the ordinary quality of everything. That pride existed. The diaries are clear about it. Hannah Cullwick writes about the satisfaction of cleaning work done thoroughly. William Taylor writes, occasionally, about the households he considers well managed and those he considers poorly managed, with the clear authority of someone who knows the difference. The system depended on that caring. A servant who felt nothing about the quality of her own work was a servant who would eventually fail to meet the household standards. The housekeeper was interested in people who cared, and if you cared, that caring became the household's asset, not your own. But the caring was supposed to be directed outward, toward the family's comfort, toward the household standards. The manual writers were not very interested in what the servant herself received in return for that caring. What she received was the same thing anyone receives from caring about their work, a sense of herself as competent, capable, real. A sense that the effort was not simply given away but exchanged for something, even if what it was exchanged for was private and unnamed and could never be listed on any character letter. It purchased in the private accounting of a working life the knowledge that you did the work well. That's not nothing. In a system designed to make the person doing the work invisible, the pride in doing it well was a small and persistent act of visibility, directed inward, where it couldn't be seen from above stairs, but present nonetheless. Every kitchen fire settled at the end of every one of those days. The coals went quieter, the room went dark, and somewhere, in the last minutes before sleep, and that person was you, in this world, on this night, in this body, a person who had spent 16 hours being managed and directed and regulated by rules she didn't write, went over the day in her own terms, decided for herself whether it had been good, whether she had been good. And in the morning, before anyone else was awake, she got up and began again. That daily beginning, that particular commitment to a new morning after a long day, is the thread that runs underneath the whole of this story. Because you can regulate where a person stands and what they're called and who they're permitted to love and whether they're allowed to laugh and what they wear on a Thursday afternoon. You can give them someone else's name in a cold room and a half day per week. But you cannot regulate the getting up, the going back to the fire, the beginning again. Every single morning that was theirs. All of it was real. The rules and the restrictions and the borrowed name and the cold room and the character that could be withheld for no reason at all. Every part of the system we've walked through tonight was real, and it mattered, and it cost people things that can't be fully accounted for. But the thing that was also real, and that I want to leave with you as the deepest truth of this story, is the persistence of the people inside it. Not the rules. The people the rules were designed to manage. They kept going. Day after day before the family woke and after the family slept, in the dark parts of a house that didn't fully belong to them, with names that weren't entirely theirs, and rooms thus are cold, and futures that depended on someone else's goodwill. Your goodwill, if you had been the employer, their mercy, if you had been the servant. And inside all of that, they remained themselves, quietly, without drama. The way the fire remains itself, even banked down for the night, even reduced to its slowest burn, still warm at the centre, still holding. That's the story underneath the history. Not the rules, but what the rules were protecting against. The persistent, unarchived, utterly ordinary act of a human being knowing who she was, in spite of everything arranged to suggest she was something else. You're in your room tonight, not the attic, not the cold room at the end of the servants' corridor with the washstand and the narrow bed and the single window that let in more January than light. Your room, your name on everything in it. But the night feels the same as it has always felt. That particular quality of the late hours, when the work is done and the house is still, and the only presence is your own. That isn't a Victorian thing, that's a human thing. This specific quiet that arrives when the day has used you up and sleep is coming for the rest. They felt this too. Every single night in those cold rooms at the end of those long days, the same drawing down towards sleep, the same release of the day's accumulated weight. You're closer to them than the history makes it seem. The distance is time, not feeling. Notice the weight of your body right now, not as an instruction, just as an observation, the way your shoulders have settled, the particular heaviness of your arms against the surface beneath you. You've been carrying something tonight, not coal, not a hod of ash, something lighter than those things and in some ways heavier, the weight of other people's days, the weight of an entire world lived in narrow corridors and borrowed names. You can set it down. It isn't yours to carry forward. You've held it long enough. Walk through the house with it, up the back stairs and through the basement and into the servants' hall and the kitchen. It has been full and real, and now it belongs to the past. Your shoulders are heavy against the bed. Your hands have stopped moving. The edges of the room are softening. The shapes that were clear an hour ago becoming gentle. The boundaries between things dissolving slightly the way they do when the body begins its long, quiet turn towards sleep. The body knows before the mind does. It knows the day is over. It knows the warmth of where you are. It's leaning into it. Go back to the kitchen, not the afternoon kitchen, hot, full of noise, the cook directing 3 things at once. The kitchen at the end of the night. The range settled, the lamp turned low, the room cooling slowly toward morning. The coals are behind the grate, orange at the centre, darker at the edges where the air doesn't reach. They're compressing, slowly, slowly, settling into each other the way everything settles when the effort stops. There's a sound they make, barely a sound. The quiet creak of cooling metal, the faint shift of coal on coal as the pile settles deeper. You've heard this before, somewhere in your body. It's the sound of the end of the day, the sound of enough. The warmth from the range reaches just to where you are. The room around you is dark at the edges. The kitchen table, the shelves, the copper pots on the hooks along the wall, all of it soft now, moving toward dark. The warmth is real. The quiet is real. The fire is settling slowly. The orange at the centre of the coals still warm, still present, going quieter. The room around it going dark. The grate holding the heat staying in the metal. The warmth moving out toward the edges of the kitchen in long, slow waves. The fire is settling. The coal finding its resting place. and your warmth settling with it. Deeper in the grate, the last light moving through it in slow patterns. The sound barely a sound, more like the feeling of sound, the faintest reminder that something is here at the centre of the house, still holding warmth for the morning. The fire is settling, the house still around it, the family asleep, the rooms quiet and dark and waiting. Not yet the next day, just this, just the warmth, just the coals, going quieter, in the room at the centre, in the long middle of the night. Your breath has been slowing for a while now, finding its own pace, not the quick shallow rhythm of a busy morning, not the held breath of a corridor where the family might appear, but something longer and looser and more like sleep than waking. You don't have to manage it. It knows what it's doing. Tomorrow, before anyone wakes, someone will go down the back stairs and open the damper, build the fire back. The house will come alive again, room by room, fire by fire, task by task. The day will begin. But that is tomorrow. Tonight the coals are banked. The house is still. Somewhere in a notebook, in the last lines of a long day, a name is being signed in pencil. A real name. The one that was always there, beneath everything the household required. Yours has always been there too. Let the fire hold the warmth. Let the dark hold the quiet. Let sleep have you now.